Well, it's never felt as fitting today as it ever has been to say good day, everybody, because we have our friends from Pirate MIDI joining us today. And the reason I say it's fitting is because you guys are located in Australia, specifically Tasmania, if I'm not incorrect there. I just wanted to say, firstly, welcome, Sam and Simon from Pirate MIDI. It's really good to have you guys on the show today.
Yeah, thanks heaps for having us. It's great. Just to clarify, I'm in Tasmania. Sam is in New South Wales.
Okay. Yeah. And New South Wales, that's what I'm more familiar with. I lived in Sydney for 13 years or so. What part of New South Wales are you in?
I'm in Newcastle, although I grew up Western Sydney. So Penrith Panthers kind of born and bred.
Awesome, man. Awesome. I was in kind of Mascot by the airport, by Maroubra Beach. Yeah, that whole area. Yeah. Man,
very good.
That's awesome. Okay, so we got, I've never been to Tasmania, by the way, Simon, but
you're missing out.
I know. That's actually,
not
I've
in
heard
June.
That from everybody. I've heard that I need to see Tasmania in the summer.
Not in June, though.
Yep.
Why not in June? Is it cold? Wait, we have a code right now.
Southern Hemisphere.
Yeah.
June is winter. Like
there's only ocean between us and Antarctica.
Yeah.
I think to clarify though, like, here I'm freezing cold right now, and it's like it's going to be a low of like 5 or 6 or something, and that's
Celsius.
kind of 5 or 6 Celsius. And middle of winter we're talking maybe 2, 3. So like Tassie's, down from that, but there's probably listeners who are kind of just like that's
there's so many clarifications we've just had to make. Southern Hemisphere, June is winter, Celsius, not Fahrenheit. Yeah.
Metric conversion.
So these non-American accents you're hearing, still English, but it's Australian accents we're talking about today. But basically, today we're going to chat about all things MIDI. Specifically, we're kind of just doing a quick brief before the episode. The real goal here is to make MIDI less intimidating. And so if you've ever thought like, I wonder if MIDI's for me, there's all these commands and numbers and control things and apps and all this sort of stuff that you need to learn. And you guys have done a great job, both through Pirate MIDI, which is your company where you actually make hardware and apps and software for MIDI controllers, which we'll talk about. But the reason this whole episode kind of came to be, or we started chatting, is because you guys recently came out with Tones and Technology Mastering MIDI Controlled Effects Pedal Boards. Did I nail that?
You nailed it.
Okay.
So good.
It's an ebook. And I've read this ebook. I've been through it. And if I'm going to be totally honest and arrogant here, to start, I went into it thinking like, okay, let's see what it is. I probably won't learn all that much new because I've been dealing with MIDI now for 15 years, and so I've answered all the questions, or so I thought. And you guys have gone into such detail as you get further and further into this ebook. You get more and more advanced. And so if you start at the beginning, I know this sounds obvious, but you start at the beginning, it does a really good job of saying, this is why we use MIDI. This is where it came from. Here's how you do some of the basics. And it does a really good job of giving you a nice, easy step into the world of MIDI and how to connect things and all that. And then it gets into LFOs and delays for MIDI messages and stacks and it really is awesome. And I learned a whole lot, and I know I'm going to be referencing back to this book when I have customers that ask me, I don't know, how do I do an LFO while also delaying this MIDI message and doing this in a stack of this while grouping switches? And you guys have done a really great job of making it accessible, whether you think like I did incorrectly that you had most of it all figured out. You guys have kind of done a really great job of easing us all into it. So I guess, why don't you guys, that was a big rant and ramble there. Sorry, but I really did and am still.
You laid it out real well.
Why don't you guys tell us, firstly, where did Pirate MIDI, because I believe Pirate MIDI came first, but where did Pirate MIDI and how did it come to be, especially in Australia of all places? I've learned firsthand that's a hard place to start a company for guitar players when most of the business is in America. But where did Pirate MIDI come to be? and then what led to this this ebook, Tones and Technology, and what's kind of the 30,000 foot view of where we're going to be starting here. I'll throw to you first, Simon, and then
Yeah,
go to you,
sure.
Sam, after that.
Yeah, cool. So basically, I started getting into software synths. I was using Main Stage 3 in the church worship band. I'm like a self-taught mixer, like mixing engineer by not by trade. I've never done it for a living, but that's where I started. Did it for a long time, and there was just stuff missing in the band, and I was like, I want pads, I want synths, I want like riffs, I want sequences, I want I want pulsing bass synths, and so I just
Don't we all?
self-taught keys, started playing, and we had a bit of a noise issue with our main electric guitarist in our small building, and I was like, hey man, amp modeling has come a long way. Maybe we should try that for better volume control in the room. And so he still wanted the foot control, obviously. So I started DIYing a MIDI foot controller just with basic switches and parts off AliExpress, actually. And yeah, just DIYed a little 6-switch controller with a tap tempo as well to run into main stage for him. And I posted it in some of the Facebook groups I was in, and people seemed pretty interested because it was real low budget, like just basic aluminium enclosure, some badly drilled holes, and chuck those switches in there with a little Arduino and some terrible soldering. And people were interested. So I started selling them for, I think it was like $75. It was called MIDI Stomp. And
what year would this have been?
People loved it. Sorry?
What year would this have been?
Late 2019, early 2020, like back half of 2019 is what it was. And so I sold 50 of them and then did another 50. And at some point in a Facebook group, a customer was asking about adding Bluetooth and all sorts of things that I have absolutely no knowledge about. And Sam jumped into a comment thread, and that's how we met. And within a year, we prototyped a MIDI controller together, and that was how it all began.
Nice.
During COVID. So, Sam, what were your? Let's just get candid here. First impressions of Simon. How did he come across online, and were there any hesitations here?
No, well, I think Simon's first impressions of me were probably more telling, because I definitely was kind of, Facebook's a terrible place for good discourse at the best of times, but it was probably along the lines of, this is not too hard. You just kind of, whack this in and do a bit of this and of that, and
you should know this. Yeah.
No, not you should know this, but I think, it was kind of like, well, it looks like a fun prototype. Here's a fun prototype solution. But yeah, no, when we kind of just got chatting, and I've mentioned before that my wife likes to joke that we met and got started because I just couldn't kind of hold my tongue on correcting somebody. I'm working on it, but yeah, and that's sort of how we met. And then back end of 2019, I was just kind of like, hey, I've got a little bit of free time. Let's make this a little better. Like, it'll just be kind of a fun, side project. I was doing, some freelance consulting work at the time, and
on circuit design and embedded systems, or like, what were you doing primarily at that point?
Yeah, so bits and pieces. Like, I was baristering at the cafe. I've been a sort of an electronics nut for forever, really. But yeah, and it kind of was just let's see where this goes, which is actually a really fun way to start designing a product in some ways, because it takes away a lot of the constraints of, you're not doing your typical large business thing of, handed down a set of criteria from marketing and a budget and this and that. You're building within that. You can kind of just make whatever you want because it's cool. And then if it gets to the point where you're like, hey, maybe there's some legs to this, then you can start focusing on the, more of the productization of it. Which is a really, not a lost art, but I think there's a lot to be gained from that approach rather than the other way around sometimes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Love it. And so you guys did Pirate MIDI, still doing Pirate MIDI, obviously, but you guys started with Pirate MIDI. And the first thing that comes to mind for me, and then I'll throw it to you, Brian, after this, but the first thing that comes to mind for me is I see someone start a MIDI controller type company, like Pirate MIDI, hardware with software built in. And the first thing that comes to mind is, man, the questions that they must get about their product. Like, how do I do this? Why isn't my MIDI pedal getting this? And why is my Strymon pedal not changing presets? And I know even for us doing, buffer interfaces and routing boxes and all that, people will come to me and say, my HX stomp isn't changing from its snapshot A to B. I'm like, this has nothing to do with my products. Like, why are you go ask line 6? And for the record,
things on my board,
listening,
so it's got something to do with it, right?
And so, by default, I've had to learn a lot about other products that really don't have anything to do with our products. Yep. And that's a double-edged sword. It's a good thing. And sometimes it's like, I don't have the time. But I can only imagine with you guys doing MIDI control that talks to all these other pedals and is integrated on a board with all these other pedals, that your customer support and the questions you get would seemingly be endless some days.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that firstly? And does that tie into why you guys decided to do the MIDI ebook, the Tones and Technology book?
It 100% ties in.
Yeah. I'll let Simon chime in on the ebook, but something that's really interesting is from the beginning with Pirate MIDI, one of our core goals was to build a really good community of people and, a kind of community where you could just kind of come and no matter where you're at, if you were, complete beginner, you could ask how do I change the snapshot on my HX stomp or whatever it is, or, what's a program change, or all those kind of questions through to really getting into the weeds of it. But it also works out quite fortuitously because the larger community you have, the wider net you can cast in terms of accessibility to devices.
Yep.
Because we'll get, customers saying, oh, I'm using such and such, and it's just not feasible that every time we have a customer with an issue with some piece of gear, for us to be able to go out and buy our own just to kind of troubleshoot for this one customer. So then if you build that network and that community of people who are eager and willing to help and interested in helping other people because they themselves have, gained from that community, then it's a pretty cool flow-on effect and saves a bucket load of money and marketplace flipping.
So what I'm hearing you say is that you don't like buying gear and testing.
You are hearing me incorrectly. You're hearing me incredibly incorrectly. No, marketplace flipping, with like an Excel spreadsheet and everything else is a great hobby of mine. So I hope I didn't give the impression that I don't.
No, I'm totally buying, because it's the same for me. Like I remember for a time when we started out with setups, pedalboard setups, we would buy all the common pieces of gear, Timeline, Big Sky, overdrives, all that. Like, man, this is the reason I started the business. I'm getting to buy gear and write it off and actually use it in setups and all that. And then very quickly, you just can't keep up.
And where do you put it? Like,
endless.
You want to have it all set up, but you can't.
Yeah.
It's just
yeah. So then, so Simon, what about all the questions, customer support, the forum? It sounds like the community you guys have. And then where did this ebook where was it born from?
Well, I think it's just been waiting to hunt me down for the last few years, because even from the very beginning with MIDI Stomp, it was very, very obvious that people just don't get MIDI. I think there's something about how basic it really is, and the fact that it's one way and everything we've been used to for the last 30 years has been two way, like USB, things just talk to each other and you just take for granted that things know what the other thing is doing. Like, and that's something that MIDI doesn't do. And so I think that's just a paradigm shift that people need to go through. So just from the very beginning, even before I'd started working with Sam, been dealing with just the most basic of MIDI questions. And then once you scale that up to, sending out 300 devices in a Kickstarter campaign, suddenly it just explodes. And so for the last few years, it's just been building a repertoire between Sam and myself of standard replies. One other thing that fed into it a bit was the fact that we started off Pirate MIDI wanting to make it easier with a from a UI perspective, a UX perspective. So that's user interface and user experience for people who don't know. And that's like how easy it is, intuitive to navigate around the device, to add MIDI messages. We added this thing called the device library. So very early on in prototyping, Sam would be doing his engineer thing and I would be data entry. I scraped, I think it was 375 user manuals in the end, and at the very start of synths, effects, apps, anything that had default from the factory MIDI commands. So something like your Eventide H9 doesn't have defaults. You have to choose which CC goes to which parameter. So that's not in there. So it's a database of, Strymons with their CC 102 for bypass, for example, all that's baked in from the start. So
you might be selling yourself short there a little as well.
It was about 29,000
You can pretty much put
lines.
in that, anything that has MIDI and has pre-assigned MIDI messages is in the device library, and then as new products come out, we're adding them as well. And, we say, hey, if you've got something and you can't find in there, send us a message, and it's in there. So it's probably the most exhaustive database of that that exists to the point where it got scraped.
Yeah, I think it's over
a book by itself. That just needs.
I think it's over 30,000 rows in the spreadsheet. Yeah.
Man, I would pay to have access to that on my phone, where I could just quickly that as its own thing. As a builder, I would pay to be able to say Chase Bliss mood and have it pop up on my screen, all the commands, and man, that would be huge. So
we actually, I was looking at doing that actually through an API. We've built a private web API for that, and we're kind of playing around with like an AI powered sort of autofill. So you'd be like, turn on my timeline when I press this, and it would sort of spit out the right command. But
so
you don't like scrolling through 30 pages of information, Grant, to find what MIDI message?
Me, man. The amount of tabs
not if it's a boss manual.
And that's the other thing. Yeah, some of them are just so hard to use and find the info. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, man, that is awesome. 30,000 lines of MIDI manuals.
Yeah, and so all that our goal to make it easier, our engagement with our customers and the Facebook group from like day one just sort of automatically unfolded to the point where it's like, okay, we get the same questions time after time. This can now lay itself out very, very nicely as a whole document. And so chapter 2 of the book, after the sort of, where did effects pedals come from and why did they get MIDI? Chapter 2 is like foundations of MIDI. Like, what is MIDI? How does it work? What kind of cables and, different transports, Bluetooth, etc. can you send it over? How is it generally implemented in effects pedals, particularly? Because that's something that you don't really find when you Google MIDI. And so that chapter 2 is free. And so if a customer asks me some questions that indicate that they're super new to MIDI and they're missing a whole bunch of really important foundations, I just say, hey, go download this chapter 2. It's free. Do yourself a favor and learn some stuff about MIDI.
Which, by the way,
questions, then come back.
Yeah, we'll say this as well multiple times throughout the episode, but we'll link the book in the show notes, whether you're on YouTube or listening on a podcast. We'll get you a link so you can go straight to it. You can read chapter 2 for free. And then we'll also, if you want to buy the whole book, these guys have generously made a coupon code available for the ebook as well. If you want to save 20% off of it, you can use that link down there as well. But I think we should absolutely get into this book and scroll through some of the highlights. We can't get through the whole book today because it's 135 pages long or something like that.
Like you said, it gets very dense towards the end. It starts real basic and very quickly you find your limit, and it's kind of designed like that so that it's can take people from not knowing anything, take them to where they're comfortable, and then if they need to stop at some point, come back a few months later, maybe then they're ready to go a bit deeper.
Yeah, I'm actually really excited to chat about it. I've been through the whole thing, but what were you going to say, Sam?
I was going to say it was not important, but I don't know if you've read all of the Dune books, but it kind of follows a similar progression where it starts out really easy and enticing, like that honey trap, and then by the end, you're sort of just like, what's
Oddly enough, this is funny you should say that.
What's real?
I was in Audible, man, a month ago. I listen to Audible on my like bike rides into work every day. And I was just like, I just need something to listen to. I don't want to learn anything for the next few weeks. I just want to listen to a fiction book. And I downloaded Dune, and so I've just been listening to Dune and slowly working my way through. So I don't know if I've been through. I know for sure I haven't been through all of them, but good books, good reference. But I still think I would take the MIDI book over Dune at this point. It's a bit more practical to my life these days.
And that's how you
make it a movie.
We're in good company.
Yeah. Brian, why don't you pause for an ad break, and then you can get straight into any questions you have for these guys as well, about what we chatted about so far.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So our first set of sponsors would be the guys over at the Guitar Sanctuary in McKinney, Texas. They are the boutique retailer of the DFW area, from Mesa amps to PRS guitars to Fender custom shops, all sorts of pedals, all sorts of MIDI controllers, all sorts of just acoustics, anything that you could think of. They pretty much have that's guitar related. So if you're going and looking for drumsticks, they don't have it. So go check them out at guitarsanctuary.com in McKinney, Texas, off of Virginia Parkway in Adriatica. So go check them out. You won't be disappointed. The next are going to be the guys over at Neural DSP with the Quad Cortex, the Cortex Control app, their plugin system, everything. They just literally posted a video a couple days ago, or a post about their newest X plugin software is going to be coming out really soon. They're in the final stages. So, if you're thinking about buying some plugins, go use their code Chairmen, CHAIRMEN, for 30% off. As Grant likes to say, that's 70% away from free, which is very true. So go check them out. You won't be disappointed. Use that discount code to buy some plugins in preparation for this new software, cross pattern or whatever, sharing compatible. Thank you.
Yeah.
Compatible software. So you can start plugging in your plugins into your actual Quad Cortex. It doesn't work on any plugins that are newer than 90 days old. So if you get a plugin that they just released, probably wait 90 days, then go ahead and get 30% off. Go check them out. Won't be disappointed. So
love it.
Those are our first two sponsors, which I'm very appreciative of. I actually worked for the Guitar Sanctuary for 6 years, so I send very high praises to them. They are a great group of guys. Speaking of, when I was at the Guitar Sanctuary, I did one board with the Bridge 6. I think it was a Kickstarter unit when it first came out. And the guy, he's like, yeah, I just got this new unit. Didn't tell me anything about it. And I got it, and I'm like looking it up and everything, and it had to been like one of the first couple of units, because I think I had messaged you guys. I was like, hey, can it do this? And you're like, sorry, I can't do that yet. And I was like, oh, okay. So we were like getting a little bit of information, but with the little bit of time that I had with it and stuff, it was really cool to see the size of it. It very much compares to some of the other units out there, like the Morningstar stuff of the size, which is really comfortable. And even I've been looking at your guys' website the whole time. The Bridge 4 looks awesome. It reminds me of there's this company in North Carolina called, I think it's North Carolina or something, called Disaster Area Designs. Matthew with them. He has one that's very small like that. So it's really cool to see these smaller form, because you'll get a lot of people that will design MIDI controllers. And I have a friend's company that asked me at NAMM, he's like, all right, what do you want to see in a MIDI controller? And I was like, not a massively large unit, something that's small, because yes, it is the brain and it's telling yourself what to do. But like, if you have a unit that's like as big as a Timeline or an H90 or bigger, and you're like, oh wow, that's cool, it must do all these things, and you're like, nah man, it only does MIDI, like it only sends PC messages, like it just gets obnoxious. So seeing these sizes is really cool. On top of, I see the click, so like it's a tip ring, right? It's like a kind of like a red remote. Like you can connect it to like a red remote of like a JHS pedal, I think it is.
Yeah.
Which is really cool. So I've been scanning through the website and everything. So it's really cool to see all these options. The fact that you guys are doing the 1/8" MIDI connection is also really cool because so many people will do 5-pin. And there's nothing wrong with 5-pin. It's just bulky and really large and obnoxious. And I was actually explaining to a guy who had messaged the store. This is a couple years ago. He called and he just goes, "What is M1D1?" And we're like, M1D. I don't know what is M. And we're like, sit there for a second. He's like, "Yeah, why do I need it?" And we're like, "Oh, you mean MIDI?" So seeing the book coming out and explaining about MIDI, and it's like even down to like I was in the book, and it was talking about like you have two devices, like both MIDI channel 1, and you're trying to send a message and it's not going to work, but then you have the second device in MIDI channel 2, like that kind of stuff. Like it's really interesting to see how that kind of concept, people are like, "Oh, well, shouldn't it just always work?" And I don't know if you guys have ever seen, there's this YouTube video where it talks about a honey badger. A honey badger doesn't care. I have relentlessly, as appropriately as possible,
That is a classic.
has told people MIDI is like a honey badger. It does not give a crap unless you're sending the right messages. Because the guy's like, "I'm freaking sending it. I'm sending it. It's 18 PC messages." And I'm like, "Okay, great. And okay, you have all the toggles, you have all the messages, you have all the CCs. If you're listening, PC is preset change, CC is a control change." So they're like, "Yeah, I got all this stuff set up." I'm like, "Okay, wait, what MIDI channel are you on?" "Oh, I don't know."
Yeah.
I'm like, well, Darren's gonna tell you, like, it does not care. You can send it how many messages, and he's like, "Oh yeah, it's MIDI 6." Oh, it ends up being MIDI 16. I'm like, "Well, you're sending MIDI channel 1, so that sucker ain't gonna it can do nothing." So
last 48 hours, I have a 25 email thread with a customer where his Kemper player was on the wrong MIDI channel. So exactly that.
You're speaking right to our souls here. Yeah.
Yep. And it's very common. And well, that's the thing with like setting up boards and stuff is like we do the legwork of setting up the channels, labeling the pedals, like having the MIDI library is really handy because one of our favorite companies, RJM, they do the same thing. They do a MIDI device library, and it's very convenient. Even then, people are still like, "I don't know what I'm doing," which is safe to say is pretty common because it's not a normal thing for people just to have, like to know, "Oh, I know how to do this." But if you can save me time, there's been plenty of devices where like I haven't dove in it. I haven't had the unit since the Kickstarter. But like having like the option to where like you can do like a general MIDI device and you type in the number, like RJM has that. Half the time, like I will just like use a general thing because there's so many MIDI companies that are doing that. You self-assign the CC, like the H90 and stuff, and the H9, and people are like, "What's the H9 bypass?" I'm like, "Well,
new layer.
What is the H9 bypass?"
It's like, that you're saying the same thing, but like you just said, the Strymon, it's 102. For like there's all like a friend's company, they were really simple. They have 3 foot switches and it's CC 1, 2, and 3. Like they did it really simple. And I think that's where when you can start customizing, because the problem you run into is when you start allowing the customization of MIDI CCs, people start trying to stretch how much that MIDI message can do. So it's like, oh, well, like I had one guy, I did a rack build for, I always say it's only me in this little space, but I had to build this rack and he had like 32 pedals and 20 of them were MIDI. You do the math real quick, you realize that there was not enough MIDI channels. So he was like, "Well, we can take one MIDI channel and we can split it up between 5 different devices because they all can customize their CC messages." I'm like, "Yes, technically you can do that." But I was like, "Should you?" That's like driving on your spare. I'm like, technically you can drive on your spare on your car. Should you?
In fact,
That's a different.
we're
That's
too busy
different.
asking if we could to think if we should.
Yes.
Should.
And
it's-
the worst thing about that too is secondhand gear. I remember chatting with someone and they had, I can't remember what it was, but it was a customizable MIDI channel, but they'd gone to a ton of effort to set up presets just the way they'd liked. And I had to break it to them where I was like, hey, unless you want to go through and do one by one and cross-reference in this, you're probably going to have to do like a factory reset on this. And it was just because they were looking up and like the manual says this, but it's not working. They got it secondhand and the previous person had played with it. And it's like, oh, what a pain.
All the time. Yeah. Anytime I get a secondhand or someone has something, I always tell people to do a factory reset, because there's just sometimes you don't
known starting state.
You don't realize the programming that they've done inside without, especially if you don't have an editor or something to connect to. So I like looking over you guys' website. It's really cool to see all the really cool options, the smaller compact size, the external little boxes to do the expression and the remote switching. Those are really handy, especially because you're making it adaptable to be able to put under like those little MIDI boxes are really cool because you can put them underneath. Like there's a company here called Creation Music Company that we use a lot of, and you can actually, it's a flat board, but it's an aluminum how it's built, so you can actually put like chalk supplies and stuff under, so like you can fit that stuff. So it's really cool to see. So really excited to dive into this book, and I'll pass it back to Grant. I could talk forever on MIDI and this kind of stuff because
I know we're both passionate about MIDI, and it's great to have some professionals here that can actually stretch what we normally would think of with MIDI as well. But I think I would love to start, and I can share my screen here in a second for all those on YouTube. I would love to start with, if in the context of the ebook, if you could snap your fingers and have every guitar player understand one thing about MIDI, what would it be?
MIDI channel.
Wow. That's a difficult question, man. That's
I can stretch it to two things. I'm feeling generous.
All right.
I've got one actually. Okay. I've got one. You cannot simply make an adapter and daisy chain split your MIDI output unless you would like to have a bad time and results that work horrifically and consistently.
Okay, so don't passively split your MIDI output. Why not?
Because you violate a known specification. Specifications are obviously, they kind of can be arbitrary, but the way, without going too much into the weeds, the way a MIDI output works is via a current loop, and the receiving device is expecting a particular amount of current in order to correctly operate. And when you split that, you are essentially halving or distributing that in some capacity, and you venture into unknown territory where maybe it works sometimes, maybe it works intermittently depending on your power supply, all that kind of thing. MIDI is designed to be robust and slow because it's from many years gone by, and it's sort of one of we're doing regular MIDI here, obviously not like USB MIDI and kind of Ethernet and RTP and whatnot, but the number of questions where I was like, hey, I've got this like kind of TRS breakout cable, can I use that? It's like, you cannot.
Yep.
Don't do it.
Okay, so don't split and this, I guess, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Sam, but in a similar way where we've talked on the show many times about pedals you can and cannot or should not share off a single power tap on your power supply. So we would say you probably can put two overdrives on a single power tap at 9 volts. You are going to share that 500 milliamps. It's going to be distributed to both of those pedals. It's the same thing with splitting your MIDI chain, except we're basically saying do not do this because you need that full current that is being sent out of that MIDI output.
And you're talking single, unit milliamps. There as well. Basically, to turn on, a photo opto isolator on the other end. It's the equivalent to taking your single guitar output and saying, I want to parallel a fuzz and a wah. Both pedals typically, very finicky about their impedances, things like that. Well, I'm going to get a mono TS kind of splitted cable, plug them into both at the same time, and then kind of passively sum them back into a mixer. Yeah. It'll do something, but probably not what you expect. No, Honey Badger.
Honey Badger don't care.
Okay, so don't split
Yeah.
don't split your MIDI outputs passively. You need to
Yeah.
get specialized boxes for
MIDI
that. What
splitters
about
exist for a reason.
yeah? What about you,
Yeah.
Simon? What would you say?
Mine is way less technical. If I could snap my fingers and every guitar player could know something about MIDI, it would be that if you start simple, you can figure it out in an hour how MIDI works. It's
Yep.
not actually that intimidating. You just got to start small and test one thing at a time.
Yep.
And then you figure it out really quickly. If you go, here's my pedal board, I'm going to get my spreadsheet out and write down all the CCs. I'm going to put them all in my MIDI controller. I'm going to plug them all in and I'm going to press the button and they're all going to work the first time. That's not going to happen. But it's not that hard if you start real small.
I got chapter 2 on my screen here from the book.
Cool.
And this is the chapter that you guys give away for free anyways, but I can tell why you give it away for free. Because if you're going to get started, you got to read chapter 2. So let me share my screen.
Sure.
It really is that if you don't read that chapter, there's not much point reading any of the other chapters, really, unless you already understand it, by all means. But like that's the
yes.
Can you guys see that? Okay.
One thing quickly, Grant. If we can after this at some point, you said there's some things that you learned from the book. I'd love to talk about those as well.
I don't know if we have time for all of them, but I would absolutely love to chat about that. And it relates to one of the other questions I want to ask you guys, which I'll give you a heads up for now so you can start thinking about it. I want to know and we're going to touch on this first part in a sec. What does a simple MIDI rig look like for a guitar player? That's one side of the spectrum. And what does the most complicated version, controlling everything on stage plus the coffee machine out front, what does that MIDI rig look like? I want to talk to like if you stretched MIDI as far as it could go, what does that practically look like for a guitar player? So I want to ask you guys that, and that's going to tie into some of the things I learned as well. But first, on screen, if you're watching on YouTube, all of this gets all of our episodes for Chairmen of the Boards get streamed on the Vertex YouTube channel. So if you're watching on YouTube, on my screen, you're going to see a table of contents. This is probably the least exciting page on this ebook. It gets much more exciting from here on out because you get graphs and diagrams and all that. But this is the beginning of chapter 2. And I want to go down to let's start with the fundamentals on page 21 here. And I think I have this right. Fundamentals of MIDI. We're scrolling through. We aren't going to read all of this, but it talks about connecting multiple MIDI devices, MIDI messages, which is where I want to stop first because I think this is really important. And you guys kind of go through this obviously one at a time and do a really good job explaining it. But this is where if I could snap my fingers, I would want people to understand the difference between, and I would use different maybe words here for what I would want people to understand, but I want people to understand the difference between setting a MIDI channel, sending a PC message, and sending a CC message. If you understand that, as far as the basic MIDI controlled guitar pedal board, you're about 95% of the way there. 100%. And I think why don't we talk channel first? If you've never done MIDI before, you need to know how to set up your MIDI channels on your pedal board. In my mind, and you guys may have a better reference. I think so far Brian has the top of the reference material here with the honey badger doesn't care. We need to try and defeat that and knock that thing off its throne for today's episode. But
there's a snake somewhere.
And so I think in my mind, the MIDI channel is like a phone number. I can't just randomly hit numbers on my phone and expect Brian to pick up on the other end. I need to know Brian's specific phone number if I want to talk to him. And that is the MIDI channel. So if I want to talk to my timeline, I need to know what is the timeline's phone number or what is the timeline's channel. Can you guys talk about the importance of the MIDI channel, and in the same vein, just because it applies, the importance of MIDI through?
Sure. So MIDI is basically originally designed to have either a third, when you've got a MIDI input, a MIDI output, and a MIDI through jack, so that either a third jack including a MIDI through, or the MIDI output just automatically sends anything that comes into the MIDI input jack out to the MIDI output jack. And so you get a daisy chain with MIDI. And so although we often talk in pedal boards that daisy chaining power can lead to problems with MIDI, it's actually kind of the design is that you daisy chain MIDI off one device to the next. And so a MIDI channel, you've got all these messages, a whole stream possibly, all with different MIDI channels running through a chain of MIDI devices. And so every message is entering every device. And so the MIDI channel actually identifies a device. And so the device is sort of listening out for its channel. And when it sees its channel, it acts on that message. And so that's why the MIDI channel is important. And like we said before, it's only one way. So the device you're sending from is just sending out stuff. It has no idea if it's being received. Yeah, whether that's an app or a MIDI controller, you have no idea. It has no idea whether the messages are being received or acted upon correctly or going into buffer overflow and not being passed down the chain. It has no idea what's going on with that.
And so I think it's probably worth clarifying too that, like, you know, we're talking about MIDI, and that's kind of traditional old school MIDI, whether it's DIN5 or TRS or whatnot. That's, you know, the old school MIDI, not, you know, USB or Ethernet, RTP, or whatever. But you're talking about MIDI through, and it's worth acknowledging, I think, that there's sort of two schools of thought in terms of how you set up your MIDI routing. You've got this MIDI through where, you know, one device goes to the next, which is how it was designed with these MIDI through ports. And then perhaps a slightly more modern way to do it, but can get more complicated is more of a star topology, where you actually, rather than running into, well, I can only have 16 devices because I've only got 16 channels, you send sort of branches of MIDI. So you can have two devices perhaps on channel one, but if you have the ability to isolate, you know, send different messages on different physical outputs, then you can have devices that are on the same channel, but you need a controller or a device that is able to send different messages to different outputs, and then you can have that channel sharing if you have this sort of branched or star topology.
Which I think is really cool with the... Sorry, Simon, I'll throw it to you in just a sec, but when I was going through the Bridge 6, the Pirate MIDI product that you guys do, and I was using the app, I was like, man, this is so easy. I didn't think about that example you just gave because I've never had a board like Brian that has more than 16 MIDI devices. If you do have a board with more than 16 MIDI devices, please tell us about it in the YouTube comments because I want to hear about that. But you guys made it so easy to send, let's say I have, just for pedals, we all know, Timeline and a Big Sky by Strymon. If I want those both to be on channel one, in the app, it's like a click. And I know I can send channel one to the Timeline, and I say I want to recall preset one. But Big Sky's also on channel one, and it's going out of a flexi port. And you guys make it so easy to say, like, just send it out of I think you guys had the 5-pin out on the 6, right?
Yeah, the 6 has the 5-pin out.
So send PC channel 1 out of the 5-pin output only. I don't want it going out of the flexi port to the Big Sky. I just want it going out of the DIN5. And then the next button, you hit foot switch 2, still on channel 1. I only want it going out of flexi port 1, but I don't want it talking to the Timeline. And I've never seen it so easily accessible. And this is a pretty into the weeds feature, but you can very quickly see, especially when we get into slightly more complex things, how this would apply. And to make it so easily accessible, I think is great. And I really appreciated that. And even just seeing that on the app for someone like myself or Brian, who uses all sorts of different MIDI controllers all the time, this is not a common thing to see it so easily accessible and right in front of your face. Like, oh yeah, I just want that to send out a DIN5. I don't want it out of the flexi ports, and USB will keep turned off for now. Maybe I'll turn that on for the next foot switch or whatever it is. So I thought that was really a really cool idea. And for one more point of clarification for anyone listening, when you heard daisy chain, that's used in multiple areas in the guitar industry with pedal boards and all that. In the same way, if you're daisy chaining your MIDI chain, it's just like your dry section on your pedal board, your overdrives, where you have to plug into overdrive 1 input, then the output of that pedal goes to the next pedal's input. output of that pedal goes into the next pedal's input, and you're daisy chaining or running them in series. That's typically how you're going to connect up your MIDI chain as well, unless we're getting into a more complex thing, which we'll leave the more complex thing for now. But if you have a couple of MIDI pedals with MIDI in and out jacks on them, you just daisy chain them and forget about it, and then just move on to programming.
And there is
Brian, if
no, that international delay. I was just going to say there is one other really interesting application for being able to send messages on different outputs as well, and that is with your standard MIDI. That's actually very slow. We're so used to modern kind of digital interfaces that operate really quickly. A MIDI message actually takes several milliseconds to transmit fully. And if you're just sending, a program change to change your presets, it appears simultaneous. But where you can run into issues is if you're sending MIDI clock, which is 24 MIDI messages per quarter note, then maybe you're sending some expression pedal emulation where you're sending, a kind of a rapid burst or a stream of MIDI messages. You can actually get congestion on the cable where you physically can't send enough messages because they're so slow. So if you can spread those out across multiple outputs, so a microcontroller in a modern MIDI controller like our Bridge 6, it can process them way faster than you can actually physically send them. So you're sort of like, imagine you've got a tiny little pipe you can send water down, but if you have multiple pipes, you can get that all out faster to where it needs to go. That's maybe a simple way to think about it.
Love it.
Yeah. So Brian, if you get a pedal board with 48 MIDI devices on it now, you can grab a Bridge 6 and send 16 MIDI channels out the FlexiPort 1, 16 more out FlexiPort 2, 16 more out the DIN 5, and 16 more out the USB. So you can have the 4 individual outputs. No problems.
I guess I've always wondered, why did they all? Maybe this is way more technical than I would even be thinking. Why did they limit it to 16 channels? Is there a reason? Like, obviously CCs, you have so many, 102.
Yeah. So the reason is MIDI is actually, could you scroll up a minute, please, Grant? We're back to the table of contents. There's so happenstance that this will help. So a MIDI message, yes, thank you. You see some ones and zeros down there. Now that's a binary representation of a number. Now that's kind of probably artistic license because it's an 11-bit 100% number there. But ignoring that, ones and zeros. So there's 8 kind of ones or zeros in a MIDI message. It's an 8-bit packet, and a MIDI message can have multiple 8-bit packets. So a control change has the first bit the first byte, which is 8 bits, tells you what type of message is it. Is it a program change, control change, system exclusive, note on, note off, whatever. Then the next byte, you have 2 data bytes after that. But in that first one, that first byte split up into halves. And the first half tells you the type of message. So you have 16 types of messages, because if you're, maybe you understand kind of binary, 4 bits gives you 16 unique values. And the other 4 bits that are left over give you 16 possible values for your channel. So some MIDI messages require a channel, such as control change, program change, so on and so forth. Some, like clock and system exclusive messages, are channel agnostic. They don't require a channel to be sent, and so those bits can be whatever. But with those 4 bits, that's why you have 16 channels. And it was a legacy reason, and it's basically carried on up until this point.
Nice. Okay. Cool. Very cool. Yeah, I've had people ask me, and I'm just like,
that's
I don't
why.
know.
If you Google MIDI message summary, there's a great little article on the MIDI.org site that kind of breaks down exactly what that looks like. If you're a really visual learner, it's a great resource.
Very
nice.
Cool. Very cool.
Okay, so we've talked about very briefly, and we can't go into great detail on every point here because this would be a 10-hour podcast, but how to hook them up. Just daisy chain them if your chain is simple enough. If you're getting started, that's going to work for you. Daisy chain your pedals, plug the MIDI output of your MIDI controller to the MIDI in of your first pedal, MIDI out of your first pedal to the MIDI in of your second MIDI pedal. And the cool thing about
noting
MIDI,
that a bunch of pedals don't have MIDI outputs.
Yeah.
And also don't connect the input to the input and the output to the output.
Important point. And that's where if you have Chase Bliss pedal with a 1/4-inch TRS MIDI on it, or some of the smaller box Strymons, you'll probably need to get into MIDI splitters, and that's another topic. But if you have a
There's a
5-pin
chapter on that.
MIDI pedal, it's in this book. So connecting the pedals, let's say you're all connected, then channels, you can basically just pick the channels for each pedal at random. You do not need to follow the order of how you hooked them up, which is kind of nice. So if I have my timeline Big Sky example, Big Sky is second in the MIDI chain. I could set that as channel 4 just because that's an available and open channel. The timeline which came before it, physically hooked up and cabled, that could be channel 8 or it could be channel 1. You just need to know what the channels are so you can tell your MIDI controller where to send those messages. So we've connected them. Channels are set. Now can we chat about when you would use and what is a program change or a PC message, and when
Sure.
you would use a continuous control or a CC message?
Yeah, okay. So like Sam alluded to before, you got these two data bytes. One gives you the number of the message. So with notes, you have 0 to 127 possible notes. You have 0 to 127 possible program change messages. You have 0 to 127 possible CC messages. And the second data byte gives you the values. So when you're talking about notes, we call it velocity. And when we're talking about CCs, we call it just the value, but they're the same part of the message. But with program change messages, data byte 2 doesn't exist. So with a program change, some people might call it a preset change, usually just abbreviated PC message. They're usually designated by manufacturers to recall an entire preset on a device. So on your Big Sky, that would recall a reverb mode as well as all its parameters, all saved into one preset. And so, usually most manufacturers make that way and don't usually ever associate it with a control. And so you can recall up to 128 presets basically. Now, with a continuous control message or a control change message, depending on who's written the manual and who's read the specification or not, they also have that value, and they are usually assigned to something where you can change the setting. So a knob on your Big Sky would be given a CC number, and if you send value 0, that would be like having the knob instantly set to fully counterclockwise, and sending 127 value on that CC number would be like instantly setting the knob to fully clockwise. So 64 is the middle number of those values. So if you want 12 o'clock, noon, that's always 64. Yeah, 50%. That's 64, and any of the values in between. So with MIDI controllers, often you have an expression pedal input, and that is so that you can control the value on the fly variably with a foot pedal, and that can be really, really handy in a lot of situations. Lots of MIDI controllers can stack up multiple messages at once, so you can be controlling 2 knobs at once, maybe on 2 different pedals even. So you could be ramping up the mix on 2 different reverbs at once or something like that.
Yep. Or you could, as you go from heel to toe on your expression pedal, which I think it's, and I don't blame people for this. I think I used to think the same way. I just assumed that when you were on heel, because I use a volume pedal, that would mean that the knob has to be on its lowest position. And when you go to toe, that means the knob is moving up or clockwise. But you could, in your double reverb example, you could have the heel down and reverb 1 is at 100% mix, reverb 2 is at no mix. And then as you ramp up, and this is in the book as well, where you can crossfade 2 pedals, you could reduce the mix of reverb 1 and increase the mix of reverb 2 as you go from heel to toe. And if you think about what's possible just in that one example alone, with MIDI, it's incredible. Like it's really cool to think of all the sound comparisons, and at the same time, you could be doing that example with a tremolo and a reverb, or modulation on a chorus and a trim, and you could be doing the mix, but you could also at the same time be controlling the speed of that tremolo or the rate of the chorus or something. Like there's just, it is endless. It is limited by your creativity. And I think that's where I get so excited about MIDI.
Yeah, one of the awesome things I think that MIDI allows on MIDI controlled effects pedals is it lets you do stuff that the manufacturer never intended or never thought of. So it actually opens stuff up. And we're probably saying this too late in the episode for all the people who went, oh no, I can't be bothered with MIDI and clicked away. But yeah, one thing I think that's a really big thing that people don't realize is you can do stuff with MIDI that your pedal can't do without MIDI.
I think as well, just to go back, and Brian, I would love to hear how you chat to customers about this as well. But a PC message or program change, or basically accessing saved sounds on your MIDI pedals presets. Basically, I think one of the questions I get quite often is, how do I get that, the timeline sound, this dotted eighth delay that I saved? It's saved in the MIDI controller. So how do I send that sound out to my pedal and get it to use it? And I think this may sound like a no-brainer for people that are really used to it. But when you're sending a PC, all of the information of the sound, where the knobs are set, what section of the pedal it's saved on, preset number 1 or preset number 10, whatever it is, that is all saved on the timeline in this example. It's in the pedal. If anyone's watched Zoolander, they're in the computer. So it's in the pedal itself. And the MIDI control is just saying, like, as if you're going into a library, getting out a book, go to this shelf and access this sound in the timeline. It's just saying, I want that sound. Please, timeline, please turn that on. And I think having that mind shift of how that works really helps with how you approach it. Because then when you want to change that sound or that preset, you can go to the timeline, adjust the knobs, resave the preset, and now that sound is saved. But the same PC message is going to access that now newly saved sound on the timeline.
Yeah.
So that's the preset. And it's in the pedal. If anyone's watched Zoolander, they're in the computer. So it's in the pedal itself. And the MIDI control is just saying, like, as if you're going into a library, getting out a book, go to this shelf and access this sound in the timeline. It's just saying, I want that sound. Please, timeline, please turn that on. And I think having that mind shift of how that works really helps with how you approach it. Because then when you want to change that sound or that preset, you can go to the timeline, adjust the knobs, resave the preset, and now that sound is saved. But the same PC message is going to access that now newly saved sound on the timeline.
Yeah.
So that's the preset. And then how I look at CCs is in certain use cases here, you'd have your preset, and then you can use CCs to manipulate that preset that you just had in real time. And you can kind of control that preset that you just recalled with CC messages, turning knobs in air quotes, and doing it that way. Brian, how do you like to explain this? I mean, you're so far the metaphor king with Honey Badger. Why don't you tell us how you approach explaining that? And I'll stop the screen share as well.
That's really carried throughout the episode, hasn't it?
I hope it continues.
Listen, if you guys make another MIDI controller and call it the Honey Badger, but so yeah, when someone asks me about MIDI, I typically will ask them if what they're trying to accomplish, if they're trying, how many MIDI pedals that they have, because you'll get people that are like, I have to have a MIDI controller. I only have one MIDI pedal. Like, okay, what's your MIDI pedal? Oh, it's an amp sim. Okay, so then that's a whole different conversation. But if they are the generic, 5 or 6 Strymon Trinity, throw in an extra, the thruple, as we recently mentioned, or you're feeling very extra and you need 2 timelines and 2 big skies, and it's happened. I had a guy who had 2 big skies and 2 timelines, and I asked him, I was like, man, why do you have that? And he just goes, layers, bro. And that was his response. So
okay.
That's what
Pedals
they're
are
like.
like onions.
Yes.
They are. They
Yeah,
are.
that's just right.
Some of pedals are like onions. But when it comes to say 6 MIDI devices or anything, like they'll be like, how do I control these things? And the last thing you want to do is give them too many options, because I think that's what happens nowadays is people are so involved in all the things they can do. Like, so like anytime like a new like this new MIDI controller came out and a client reached out, he's like, dude, look at this. And I think it did like 15 and 20 different things. And I saw the first 2 lines that said it said loops on and off, or a couple lines is like loops on and off, PCs and CCs. I'm like, great. That's all I need to know. I don't care about the clock and the notes, and all that stuff is really handy because you can do Ableton and all this stuff. I get that. But when it's like a pedal board and stuff, like as long as it can do those couple things, it's pretty simple. So I always tell them like focus on the stuff that you're trying to accomplish. Don't focus on, because RJM where they do really well is they do all these different. I think all the things, because I've been diving through the editor while we've been talking,
Very
and
good.
like all these banks, which is awesome. The editor is really cool. It's really
It's
cool
worth
how
noting
you can
that
custom
anyone
with it.
can go to the editor. You don't need a device. It's just
Which is
Exactly. That's
actually
what
very
I
handy.
did, which is so handy because that's what I was messing with, because I just logged in through my Gmail, my Google account or whatever. I was able to get on and I can do all the bank naming. And it surprised me when I clicked on the foot switch in a pop-up menu and I could edit it, which was really cool. So it's really intuitive. But like
Thanks.
I had like, some of these like controllers where people be like, oh man, I have 16 pages of options. Like, yeah, you technically you do. Like when I send out a unit, I think I use 4 of the pages on some of the controllers. And they're like, all right, so page 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all the way up to 16. I want each page to be a MIDI device. I'm like, and my eyes start getting wider. I'm like, okay, why? Why? What are you trying to do? I want every MIDI CC possible for each device on a foot switch. Okay, well, why do you want the mix
Yeah.
knob? Well, so I can go from 25 to 75% mix. Okay, when are you doing that? Oh, I don't know. It just sounds like it'd be a really cool option. I want to go from 75 to 32% modulation. Okay, and then what you find is I actually had someone that did this. He did it with all this like you doing stuff like the HX stomp or these types of like multi effects. That stuff is fine, but you get one pedal where you're accessing every CC message just because it gets so like you end up spending way more time managing your presets and your controllers and building your presets than you do practicing.
Yeah.
And I say it all the time because
Guilty.
I've learned it from experience. I've had the big switching system 32 by 18 boards, and I'm like I switch out all sorts of pedals and pedal boards all the time. It's funny, growing up I had a friend who was constantly like switching out guitars. He had different amps, he had different pedals, and I was like, man, this guy switch, but he's a really good player. And I was like, man, he's always switching out pedals. Why? And I now know, because it's a little bit addicting to not always be searching for something cool and new. But I realized that on these big, complicated, crazy switching systems, is I spent so much time programming than I did practicing. So like, having my own company and having kids, and you only have so much time to do everything in a day unless you want to be practicing till 3 o'clock in the morning, that kind of thing. Like I would be practicing till sometimes 2 o'clock in the morning because of how much programming I was doing. And then like my
Right.
wife would be like, hey, are you done? You've been in here for 2 hours. I'm like, I just got done programming. Now I have to practice. And then that's a whole other thing.
Yeah.
So like that's like when people come to me and they'll ask me about MIDI CCs and PCs, I will do kind of the same with you guys. It's funny, you were talking about, Grant was saying the analogy of like the MIDI message is like the phone number when he's trying to contact me. That's kind of how it feels, because the MIDI message gets you that direct access to that MIDI device. Same thing as like getting a phone call, or say you have to call someone for support and you have to press 5 to be contacted through this person. That's like a CC message or a PC message. Like
Yes.
essentially in a ways you're having it's always funny when you like call those and like if you know your party's extension, press it now. And I'm like, sucker, I don't know that extension. So having those options, having those like those charts and stuff to be able to see what PC number you have, what CC number you have, what MIDI number you have, it all works together, as well as like the same things you guys are talking about, MIDI splitting and MIDI just. I had one guy who wanted a MIDI Y cable with like 5 connections on it. And I was like, I can't do that. I cannot do
Red
that.
flag.
There's so much stuff that could go wrong. So but yeah, no, I try to keep it. I use the KISS method, keep it simple, stupid. That's the method I use for explaining MIDI, as like you know where you want to go, what do you want to do, and like, oh, I want to control the on off. Okay, cool. That's this. This is how you get to that. But I think when people start diving into the possibilities, it's like grocery shopping on when you're hungry. It's like, oh man, well, we need this, we need this, we need this. And you're just like, you get home, you're like, I didn't need any of that. Why did I need any of that? And it's like, well, it's because you're hungry. And it's the same kind of thing. So that's
MIDI.
Right, hungry for MIDI. So, and that's the thing is like MIDI, you can do so much stuff. I freaked out when I learned how to send a MIDI note to my iPad to trigger tracks years ago. And I was like, oh, this is amazing. I never used it. I just clicked it with my finger. So whenever someone asks me, I always go through the basics, like, okay, what are you trying to do? And then the conversation kind of goes from there, the warp into what they're really trying to do without it being too much. So yeah, it's because MIDI can feel daunting, but it also can make things significantly easier. I have a lot of MIDI pedals on my board, and I don't even use a MIDI controller to change the presets, just because it's one of those things like I just don't have the time. I just don't have the time to sit down and build all this stuff. Having something to bridge for looks really convenient, to where you can recall presets and stuff is really cool.
I'll tell you
So,
what,
like,
we'll get you a bridge 4, and I will hand sign underneath Honey Badger, one of one.
Perfect.
Do it.
Yes.
I'm already gonna reach out to Grant and have him laser engrave me a Honey Badger enclosure for my next junction box.
Yep.
But yeah, so I would. That's how I go about it. So first off, thank you. That's how I feel about MIDI. I feel like people, as much as amazing as it can do and all this crazy stuff that it can do, and sometimes I think people get overwhelmed with how much they can do instead of how much they should do. So
option paralysis, right? The more you can do, the less you actually get done, because you spend your time just thinking, and then you realize an hour's gone by and you're like, I connected 3 patch cables.
Yep.
Absolutely.
What happened?
It's a real thing.
This is middle of the day kids nap time. This is precious.
Literally, you barely have an hour, if that. My kids, they don't nap anymore because they're older. But it's like going. I don't know if you guys have them here in US. We have a store called Costco, so it's a big warehouse. So I don't know if
sorry, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Just went for our first Costco experience.
Okay.
2 days
there are only
ago.
like 2 or 3 in the country.
Yeah. One just opened up here, and my wife and I went, and we specifically went on a daycare day, so we were one child fewer, and we were just kind of like, wow, it's the biggest box of Cocoa Pops I've ever seen. Get the biggest.
You go to the food court though.
Milo.
You got to go to the food court. If you go to Costco.
I did. I tried their pizza. It was all right. I'm a big pizza snob, though.
Big pizza.
Okay. Yeah. It's different in every country you go to. So in Canada, there's poutine, and Costco poutine is awesome. Okay. Like, it's really good. You go to America, they have the chicken bake, and I know I have people listening right now that are just like, praise Jesus. It's the chicken bake is awesome. The chicken Caesar salad in America is awesome. But then you go to Australia. That's the one I don't really know all that well.
There's all pork hot dogs.
Okay.
There's pizza by the slice. And there's
French fries.
Yes.
The fries in Canada are really good.
Well, there you go. There's also drink refills of your Coke, Sprite, Fanta, and pies, and that's it.
Oh, you guys got pies.
Meat
Yeah,
pies, not sweet pies. You got to
meat.
clarify
No,
for
meat
the
pies,
Americans.
yeah,
A
yeah,
meat
yeah.
Oh,
or
yeah.
beef,
Meat pie, savory
beef
pies.
pie. Yes,
Yep.
savory pies.
Okay.
We eat way
a
more
proper
savory
pie.
pies down here than sweet pies.
Yep. It's
Sweet
not a
pies
bad
are
thing.
kind of like for Christmas and old people.
Oh,
sort
well,
of.
that's where you
Yeah.
lost me. I tried getting
Strange.
pie for my wedding. I literally
done
asked
that
my wife,
here.
like, we need
Yeah.
pie for my wedding. And I got married in Australia.
See, we
But,
had pizza at my wedding, so there you go.
Okay, nice.
Yeah, it was
Okay.
great.
Well, that's a nice
Clearly did their
Costco
market
tangent.
research.
I sorry, Brian, you go.
I was just gonna say the reason I was mentioning Costco, as you have just now
I'm
witnessed.
sorry. We totally just took over.
No,
there.
no, I don't care. I think it's great. I have to clarify. You said fries, Grant.
Yeah.
Are
Hot
like-
chips for the Aussies.
Hot
so like
chips,
chips?
chippies.
So wait, are they? So are fries French fries
Yep.
or are they chip? Okay. So,
Hot chips
I had
are
We
to
say
French fries.
chips, but it's highly
yeah.
context dependent.
Chips
Yeah.
means
Whether we understand.
rectangular hot potato in oil, or chips also means chips in a bag, like crisps.
Yeah.
usually.
Crisps.
As you
Just
would
context.
Yeah.
See,
I have a
Costco.
There's hot chips or
Costco hot
chippies.
chips are good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Costco
Yeah,
hot
you
chips
have
are
to
really
try.
good.
Yeah, I have a client who's English, so he uses a lot of those words, and I'm like, he'll say stuff. I'm like, can you
Plectrum.
explain? I'm like, oh, okay, like I get that now or
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah.
See,
it always
normally
throws
we
me off
avoid
when I-
any comparison to the English as Aussies. It's like, how dare you, sir? But in this instance, maybe
Yeah.
a little apt.
Yeah, Brian gets confused when when the customer says he's going to put his pedalboard in his boot, and it's like,
Yeah, it
that
does.
must be one big boot you're wearing,
Must be
because that
brutal.
doesn't make any sense.
Chuck my thongs on and walk it out to the boot.
Yes,
But-
that was thongs
wow.
plural.
Always
Yeah.
plural.
So let me get to. I want to chat about our last two sponsors, and then I want to talk about MIDI at its simplest form, and then I want to try and stress people out with MIDI in its most complex. So we're going to chat about that, along with a couple common questions I always get and your guys' solutions. But first, let me tell you about two of our sponsors. The first one is Mono Creators. You can find them at monocreators.com. You already know we are huge fans of Mono Creators. I need to specify, again, context dependent, not Mono the kissing disease. Mono Creators, we love them. The soft bags are going to be here during the apocalypse. They last forever. Cockroaches and Mono soft bags stick around forever.
Boss pedals.
And Boss pedals. They just don't break. The zipper quality, how they sew everything together. I lost my word for sew there. They just keep going. I know Brian, Mason, and myself have had the same Mono bags for 10 years plus, and they're still going strong. They do a new range of pedal boards and lightweight, low profile power supplies with high current outputs. Definitely worth checking out monocreators.com. Use the code Chairmen for 10% off of your order, whether that's for a pedal board, soft bag, soft pedal board bags as well, which is one of my personal favorites. I know Brian has a little bit of a mono backpack fetish. I'm more on the pedal board soft bags. I'm a big fan of mono soft bags there. So whether you're getting any one of those things, use the code Chairmen, CHAIRMEN, for 10% off or 90% away from free. And I also want to tell you guys about Bestronix. I was just emailing Brad yesterday, actually. I needed to get some more of those rubber black boots that go on the back of locking jacks to protect the connections. I was emailing Brad to get a big pack of those yesterday. And I have to say, again, singing Brad's praises at BTPA, he was on holiday and I still got a reply from him. Half of me was like, Brad, why are you talking to me while you're out of the office? Secondly, it was like, man, thank you so much for getting back to me and letting me know that you'll get back to me soon, when you're back in the office. Super quick responses, great prices. Whether you need cable, connectors, these rubber boots that go on the back of the D-socket connectors, anything you need to finish off your pedal board and get it built right, you can get at btpa.com or Bestronix. And ask for Brad, tell him the Chairman sent you. And if you like saving money, use the code DACHAIRS, DACHAIRS, for 10% off your order at btpa.com. I also want to mention as well, if you go to Pirate MIDI, you can use the code Chairman there for the next 4 weeks only. And you can get 10% off your order if you want to check out the Bridge 6 or the Bridge 4, the MIDI controller we've been referencing quite a bit that these guys are responsible for. I think it is well worth it. Check out the app first. It's on screen right there. Thank you. Check out the app like Brian was doing. You don't need a MIDI controller to actually do it. You can get a feel for the app, see if what we're talking about here is actually, in your lane and what you're looking for. But man, it was easy to use. And I really also have to mention, we haven't talked about this yet. I really like the RGB LEDs, the bicolor. So it's a set. So 2 different sets of RGB LEDs per foot switch. And so it's really cool if you're into color coding everything. So use the code Chairman at piratemidi.com and you can check that out as well. And yeah, I think that'll be pretty cool. So now let's we're going to try and hit both sides of the spectrum here. I want to firstly make people feel, if we haven't already, a little bit more comfortable with MIDI. And, what would the simplest MIDI pedal board be? Let's say they have a Bridge 4, the 4-foot switch version of your guys' MIDI controller. And they, just to stick with the common example, they have a Timeline and a Big Sky. What is the simplest way people would use this MIDI controller? And then we're going to swing right on over to the other side of the spectrum after that. And we're just going to try and freak people out with what you can accomplish with MIDI on the other side. So let's start simple first.
You take it, Simon.
All right.
Simon, what is the simplest way people would do this?
All right.
Oh, is that the printed version?
It's not actually out yet, but I do have a printed copy. I thought being a reference guide kind of thing would be really cool to have, nice wide margins.
I would get a printed version as well.
Be able to pull it up.
I like writing in my books.
Right. So in chapter, what chapter are we in here? Chapter 5. There's 2 real basic ways. One I call the program change method, and the other one is the bypass engage method. And so what I would do, there's sort of 2 ways. If you're just wanting to turn pedals on and off, and they're all MIDI controllable and they've all got bypass controls, what I would do is you can see the little table on the screen there that Grant's just brought up. On 1 foot switch, I would just stack up messages as like, this is this sound, and it has this pedal on, this pedal off, the other pedal off, and the other pedal on. And that just sends those messages, and bam, my pedal board goes to that state, kind of like a loop switcher where you hit your switch and it bypasses and engages, pedals in and out of the loops, and do that for a few different switches. So that's one really simple thing I do. And then the other one is what we talked about earlier, just recalling presets. So if you're wanting to actually really change up your sound, which is where I think the real power in MIDI comes out, then stack up those program change messages. One interesting thing to note is that if you put in a lot of effort, like if you're really stingy, if you want to buy like the cheapest $40 MIDI controller off AliExpress or something, you can get away with spending a lot of time lining up all your presets on your pedals so that preset 1, because some of the times these cheap MIDI controllers can only send 1 message. And so if you've got switch 1 sends out program change 1, if you make program change 1 on all your pedals the right sounds so that you want all those to be together, so sorry, words are mixing up here, but yeah, and then you line up preset 2 on every pedal so that they're the sounds that you want to play together on the board, and then preset 3 and so on, then you can use one of those really, really cheap MIDI controllers if you so desired. But
I don't recommend it though.
No, highly complicated, but that's if you're really stingy. That's right. But what's on the screen there is a more easily recommendable method where you just stack up the presets for each pedal that you want to change. And that on a mini board, that could just be 2 or 3, or it might just be 1, like your HX Stomp. If you just sort of want a couple of banks on the controller, presets 1 to 4, but they're just all over the shop on the actual HX Stomp, you can just be recalling preset 12, preset 92, preset 111, and preset 31. But they all just are right there with the LEDs a little scribble strip. Bob's your uncle.
Love it.
Yeah.
So that would be the simplest way, recalling some sounds. And basically the thing that I always get from customers is I want to hit one button and I want multiple things to happen on my pedal board. And that's what we're talking about here.
So in that case, you're looking at spending more on your MIDI controller, because those really cheap ones, they generally, even the really simple Boss ones, they can generally only send one message at a time.
Yeah. Cool. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's kind of MIDI at its most basic in the context of a pedal board. Now, Sam, are you going to be the one to take MIDI to stress people out?
Sure. Well, I'm usually, as the kind of the engineer brain, I'm usually the one who just overly complicates things anyway. So
all right. So let's say
as well.
Let's say you got 60 seconds to stress us out. What are you going to tell us about MIDI at its, if you're going to stretch MIDI to its limits in the context of being a guitar player, playing on a stage in a venue? What could you pull off in theory and in reality? What could you pull off?
Great. Well, if you want to really stress people out, how about being responsible for not only your own guitar tone, but the right triggering of the backing track, sending timing clock to mixers, outboard effects, behind the stage, maybe you're generating MIDI clock, corresponding to click track generation, then sending that to your keys player who's relying on, on that signal getting there. And maybe you're triggering DMA lighting effects, so you can send MIDI into your computer and trigger lighting rigs from that. There's a bunch of really common applications, but it's not uncommon at all to see MIDI controlling not just audio but general AV setups as well. So maybe that's triggering slides behind you, or it's triggering lights and smoke machines and whatever else. Generally, anything that can kind of be controlled from a computer or from clicking something, not just a pedal board, can be controlled via MIDI as well. And that's where you get, cables running off stage, all sorts of pretty crazy stuff. So if you think, just timing your looper at your local pub is a lot of responsibility, then maybe that level of hectic touring setup is not for you, but you can do it.
So you could control multiple tracks rigs, a redundant, a main tracks rig, the other guitar player's pedal board, the drummer's click track, the keys player's sounds, plus the LFOs and modulation for that keys player, lighting, smoke machines, possibly things on the sound desk at front of house, maybe? I don't know. Is that possible?
So a lot of people actually do, they'll trigger... I know some people actually use it to trigger automatic gain staging on the mixer if they want to change their actual amp output. So ideally your amp volume, remains consistent through presets. But if you actually, for some reason want to be changing different amps or changing how much, air you're pushing out of an amp, and that's the only way you can get a particular sound, you can set it up so you can actually trigger maybe like a gain trim on your mixer at the same time as pushing that hotter signal through to the mic.
Man. Okay. Well, consider me stressed. I think one of the things Simon was asking was one of the things that I was learning about, and there are actually quite a few, from how you can use LFOs, which is in MIDI controller land still pretty new. I know Morningstar does their version of LFOs. You guys have LFOs. And basically, if I was to, from my understanding, being able to dumb this down, and you guys correct me if I'm not doing this justice, an LFO is almost like you have an automated, in its simplest form, an automated expression pedal, where you're saying, I want this expression pedal to go heel toe, and kind of a sine wave motion. And we have that on screen as well. Or you could do sawtooth or triangle waves, and you can just kind of control the mix knob on your MIDI pedal to go in this predictive motion. And if you think about that across a whole, like one MIDI pedal with tons of different knobs, and you can control all sorts of things going all these different wacky ways, you can get some really cool sounds. And admittedly, I've done that a few times, but I have by no means stretched that, to its limits on what you can pull off. But the thing I really enjoyed seeing and reading about in the book, this is in one of the later chapters, was where you talk about almost like an automated using an LFO and a MIDI message delay. So you hit the button, there's a time delay, and then the MIDI message sends in ambient and volume swells. over MIDI. So you can do these kind of transition ambient sounds without having to use the volume pot on your guitar or a volume pedal, and do more complex ambient layers. And I loved reading about that. Had never thought about that type of approach with MIDI. And that's one example of probably 4 or 5 things that I was reading through this book. It's like, oh, never thought about approaching it that way. Like, it was really interesting. And so that was probably the highlight for me, was this
Nice.
ambient MIDI message delay to create these smooth transitions, and talking about the crossfades with expression, crossfading from one pedal to another. That's something I've done before, but I think it just
Yep.
reminded me again, like, oh man, the combinations here go far beyond the usual programming I do of program changes and basic CC messages. Like, it really is a creative tool that you can use. And so I
Yeah.
think those are kind of some of my highlights in the book. And again,
Nice.
the book is going to be linked below. I do, even if it's just a free chapter to start, I do really recommend you guys checking it out, because it's really cool. And the rest of the book goes in great detail as you're hearing. But yeah, I thought that was a really cool section in the book as well. There's one other thing I was going to mention, but I think I've lost it, as happens these days. But yeah, I think the book, you guys have done a great job on it. I think it would be unfortunate for people to just kind of skim through this thing. Like, the amount of work, it must have been hundreds of hours to put this thing together. It's deep. And I really do appreciate it, even if it's just for me. I really do appreciate the fact that you guys went out to so much effort here. Like, I'm already getting so much out of it. But
Nice.
yeah, I think that's
awesome.
my rant and ramble in the last 2 minutes we have here. Any kind of final, Simon and Sam, Brian, any kind of final encouragements, thoughts you'd give people that are thinking like, maybe MIDI is worth a shot for my board? Like, anything you would kind of say to summarize the episode, thoughts from the book, what would you guys kind of say there? I'll start with you, Sam.
Well, I don't know. You covered so much. One thing I will say, I forgot to mention on your spaceship MIDI controller example. You could throw all of that in, and then in between sets, you could be playing Snake on your MIDI controller. Old
That's
school
really the
Snake.
important
If that's really random, it is. We just released our version 2.0 firmware. And along with that, there's actually a bit of a treasure hunt or an Easter egg hunt in there, where there's a series of kind of clues that we've released, some easier ones. And if you solve them, you unlock the ability to play Snake on your MIDI controller.
I love it.
With the foot switches. And if you beat a particular score in Snake, then you will also unlock a early bird access and also discount to some new products we have coming up. So take all of that, and then in between sets, you just like tapping away, being like, kind of, it's like looking busy, but actually just playing Snake.
Yep.
While the drummer's tuning. Yeah.
Love it.
While the drummer's busy tuning, you can play
That's
Snake.
perfect.
Right.
Anything you'd summarize up, Simon?
One thing, we've mentioned all the technical side of the book and that it's a really good reference guide, but one thing I haven't said is that I've made it super conversational in style. It's not a technical manual. It is just super easy. I like to write the way that I speak. That's the way I read things most easily, is when they're just flowing as natural speech. They just sort of make sense better to me. And so that's sort of the way I wrote it. So yeah, if you're worried that it's a super technical book, it's not. You'll find it very, very easy to digest until you hit the point, maybe, if your MIDI knowledge hasn't caught up with the complexity of the content just yet. But yeah.
Love it.
It's just like a chat with a good friend over a cuppa.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a cup of tea or coffee for those of you in America.
No, it's a cup of tea.
Okay.
Exclusively.
All right. I'm not much of a tea drinker, so I just slot coffee in there whenever I heard it.
Yeah.
Sorry. Brian, any final thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I say it every episode. I probably do, but just like, do the research, figure out the parameters that you want to use. Like, don't feel like you have to overcomplicate what you're trying to do. A big way to realize if you need or don't need a MIDI controller is take the board that you're using and play, go play your gig, play your set, wherever you're playing at church or a bar, wherever you're at. And when you're playing, try to mentally, in the midst of you playing and whatnot, try to mentally think of like the pedals that you're constantly hitting. So if you're constantly hitting, these certain overdrive pedals, maybe a MIDI controller that has analog loops where you can turn that stuff on. Or if you know that you're always switching between these MIDI presets on your H9 and your Big Sky, whatever, like maybe, you could consider it, because those types of things that they'll just significantly cut down how much less you're staring down at your board, less worrying, less, oh, am I going to fumble? And when I'm banking up to a new preset on my timeline, am I going to accidentally kick the knob or break the knob? And, then that opens up a whole thing. So like start like just thinking of ways that you can make your life easier without it being too crazy, because if you add on to the already chaoticness of your setup to try to make things easier but really make it worse, and it just like it becomes a headache, and you start having to figure all this stuff out. You're up till 4:00 in the morning trying to figure out why you can't send a PC message because it's on the wrong channel for the past 6 hours, like that kind of stuff. So like just take the time to learn what you're wanting to do, what you're wanting to execute, and then once you've had time to sit down and you have all that stuff ironed out, then start exploring. Like take the time. You're ready to implement new, fancier, turn on my coffee maker feature. Like do that once you have all your other stuff figured out. So that's what I would say. Also, thanks for being on the show.
I'd very welcome. I'd add on too. Just start somewhere. Like simple MIDI is better than no MIDI. You press the button and something else turns on. You get that dopamine hit. You see the lights. You hear the sound, and then take another step. Don't tackle it all at once if you're not confident. Just start somewhere. Ask for help. Like anything,
So just to reiterate again, everything we've chatted about today is linked below if you guys are curious. If you're MIDI curious, check out the links. And I will say this is probably the most genuine or the most heartfelt thank you guys for your time. Because of time zone differences, we're now coming up on 2 a.m. for you guys. And I really appreciate you guys sticking with us this long and opening up the world of MIDI and, kind of helping us get that much closer to a better controlled Tone Town as we make our way there. So thank you guys so much. And
thank you.
We'll
Thanks for having us.
Episode. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't normally look like this blinking as much. It's 6 hours past my bedtime.
Well, we really appreciate it, guys. Thank you. We'll finish up there so you guys can get some well needed and well deserved rest, and we'll chat to you guys all soon.
No worries. And if people have comments or questions as well, we'll try and check those out and get back if there's anything of particular interest. So leave a comment.
Love it. See you guys.
Awesome. See you guys.
Thank you.